backbench debate on transport in the North. Diana Johnson to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that this House has considered transport in the North. And can I just say it's very nice to see a fellow Yorkshire MP in the chair for this debate on transport in the North. And generally, I want to thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting time to debate this important issue, the many honourable members from across the House who've sponsored the application, and particularly my co-sponsors, the honourable members for Shipley and for Brigg and Gould. Now, over the last 4 months, the Transport Secretary has made a number of significant announcements about transport in Northern England. On the 20th of July, he released a written ministerial statement cancelling a range of rail electrification projects, including Oxenholme to Windermere and the whole line north of Kettering to Sheffield and Nottingham. And as background, the privately financed plans to electrify the Hull to Selby line had already been scrapped in November 2016, despite Transport for the North describing the scheme as one which was intrinsic to the story of transformation and provide necessary conditions to support the radical step change required to deliver the Northern Powerhouse and strategic transport improvements to underpin this. Now, the Department of Transport are claiming that bimodal diesel-electric trains will realise the same significant improvements to journeys as electrification. And on the 21st of July, the Transport Secretary, in speaking to the press, cast doubt on the electrification of the Transpennine route and again talked about bimodal trains. And finally, on the 22nd of August, he wrote in the Yorkshire Post boasting there was to be a record £13 billion worth of investment in northern transport over the next Parliament. But to secure further gains, he said, it was up to northern leaders, backed by Transport for the North, to realise these gains ourselves.
Would my honourable friend may I congratulate her on having secured this debate with others. As she describes the recent announcements by the government, doesn't that make our constituents ever more conscious of the significant disparity there is in investment in transport in the north compared with London and the south east? And would she agree with me that if we are really to have the kind of transport infrastructure that we require for our future economic development, we need both the money and the powers to take decisions for ourselves?
As ever, my right honourable friend puts his finger right on it. We need the money and the powers. And alongside many honourable members on both sides of the House, I sought this debate this evening to have the opportunity to hold the Secretary of State to account for these announcements over the summer. And whilst it's good to see a Transport Minister on the Treasury bench, I am disappointed that on this very important issue for the country, the Secretary of State is not here to listen and respond to this debate, as it's his actions over the summer and in previous months that have prompted this debate. So this evening I want to make the case for a much bolder and more ambitious transport strategy for Northern England. And despite what has been claimed, Britain is becoming more, not less, regionally divided. The inequality between our region's economies is the largest of any country in Europe, and the productivity gap between north and south is widening. I will give way.
Grateful to for giving way. Does she accept that the regional disparity in terms of funding, particularly on transport, has been the same for decades? This is not a party political issue. It is one we should be working together on cross-party to make sure the future investment in projects is more fairly distributed throughout the UK.
I don't want this to be party political. I want it to be cross-party. This is in the interests of Britain. So we in Parliament should work together on this. I will the one last time, because I'm conscious there's not much time.
Okay, well, I thank my honourable friend for giving way and pay tribute to her for this debate. But does my honourable friend agree that for far too long improving that equality between the north and the south in terms of transport infrastructure has meant improving links between the north and the south rather than within regions, which is what will really boost our regional economies?
Again, my honourable friend makes that point very well, and I absolutely agree with it. I just want to pursue this issue about regional inequalities. I want to say this, that one core goal of public spending should be to tackle the deep-rooted inequalities between our regions. But all too often, our transport and infrastructure spending has reflected these inequalities, or even worse, compounded them. The gap in transport investment between the north and the capital is stark and widening. Nowhere is this divide more apparent than in Yorkshire and the Humber. We are to get just £190 per head in future transport investment over the next few years, the lowest of any UK region. London will get £1,943 per head, 10 times as much. And Transport for the North, with new statutory powers, is to get £60 million to develop transport plans for the whole of the north of England. This sounds impressive, until you note that as long ago as 2008, Transport for London was spending £50 million just on advertising. So whilst I welcome the £13 billion, which I'm sure the Minister is going to talk about, that's available for Northern Transport over the next 5 years, I want to put it in the context of the London Crossrail projects. Crossrail 1, a single project in London, costs more than the North will get in this entire Parliament, at £14.8 billion. The new Crossrail station at Tottenham Court Road cost £1 billion. And Crossrail 2, with an initial budget of £31.2 billion, could yet dwarf it even further. And Crossrail 2 was given backing from the Secretary of State this summer, at the same time as he was cancelling investment in the north. And in backing Crossrail 2, I don't recall the Transport Secretary saying that London had to have bimodal trains. They're getting electric trains. Now, the practical consequence of this divide are clear for all to see. It takes longer to travel from Liverpool to Hull than it does from London to Paris, and that's without the frequent delays. And as IPPR North has highlighted, if the North had received the same transport investment as London over the past decade, we would have received an additional £59 billion. So we cannot afford to ignore 3 regions with a population almost twice that of London and an economy larger than the 3 devolved nations put together. There are immense economic gains to be realised if we plug the gap in transport investment. And as the Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review highlighted, a proper investment plan for the North, including major transport investment, would create an additional 850,000 jobs and add £97 billion to the economy by 2050. And although I admit priorities need to be reordered, it does not have to be an either-or choice between London and the South East and the rest. The underlying problem is that compared to other countries, Britain spends well below the international OECD average on infrastructure. And all political parties must acknowledge this is a national concern requiring urgent attention. Now, the previous Chancellor recognised the potential of the Northern Powerhouse. Indeed, he coined that phrase. And he set out some ambitious promises for this region. In the short to medium term, we were promised dramatic improvements in our existing railways and stations. In the longer term, he expressed support for the 25 to 30 billion Crossrail for the North, promising to halve journey times between Leeds, Manchester and Sheffield to 30 minutes. We were told that our strategic road network would get unprecedented levels of new investment, spearheaded through a new organisation, Highways England, who promised to invest in 43 road improvement schemes across Northern England. This included the A63 at Castle Street in Hull, and work was scheduled to begin by 2018. And finally, the previous Chancellor promised new powers devolved to Northern England to help realise all these gains. Transport for the North, created in 2015, was to eventually become a statutory subnational transport body and assume powers similar to Transport for London. It was to work alongside stronger local councils, a network of LEPs and powerful elected mayors. But sadly, the reality has not lived up to these promises. And I want to ask the Transport Minister this evening to make the 5 following commitments. Firstly, the government should spell out exactly how it expects bimodal diesel-electric trains to realise the same benefits as electrified ones. A short written ministerial statement will not cut it. All the evidence suggests that they are an inferior option. These will be the first bimodal trains built in Britain since the 1960s. In Britain, diesel cars are being phased out at a time when diesel trains seem to be being phased back in. And in all those European countries which still have non-electric lines, they are all pursuing electrification. There is strong evidence that in diesel mode, bimodal intercity express trains will be slower than the ones they replace. Great Western Railway has admitted this in the case of their intercity trains on their line. No rail system that is not electrified can be described as high speed. And it's ironic given that previous Whitehall statements have referred to the North getting high speed 3. So, Network Rail promised electrification. They said it would deliver shorter journey times, 20 to 30% less CO2 emissions and 33% lower maintenance costs. All these gains may now never be realised. Journey times from Manchester to Liverpool look set to be 30 minutes longer than promised, and journeys from Leeds to Newcastle 20 minutes longer. And where does this leave plans for future rail investment, especially Crossrail for the North? Northern leaders and Transport for the North had always been clear that the short to medium term rail improvements ran hand in hand with the longer term plans. In developing Crossrail for the North, Transport for the North is still working from the baseline assumption that these rail upgrades will deliver the journey time improvements promised. So if the Transport Secretary is so confident in his approach, then he should publish an independent expert assessment of exactly what kinds of travel times, CO2 emissions, upfront costs and maintenance costs we can expect from bimodal trains that he is so keen on. This assessment should state whether they will meet Transport for the North's baseline assumptions and assess what impact they will have on realising the longer term investments such as Crossrail for the North. It seems to me that the Transport Secretary must have known all those years that he's been making boasts about electrification that bimodal technology existed. And instead, bimodal technology is now one of the excuses, alongside the discovery of Victorian rail tunnels in the north, for dropping investment plans. Secondly, the Minister must urgently address the uncertainty caused by the Transport Secretary's recent announcements and recommit to the investment the previous Chancellor promised. He must commit to rail electrification of TransPennine, the Midlands Main Line, Hull to Selby, and those parts of the North West Triangle which are still due for completion. And in order to realise the key economic benefits for our region, we must give, and he must give, Crossrail for the North priority over Crossrail 2 for London. Thirdly, the government should provide Transport for the North with the powers that they were promised, along the same lines as those in London. We now know that in the statutory instrument to be laid shortly in Parliament, Transport for the North will not have nearly the same powers as Transport for London. In the North, we need to be able to finance infrastructure projects and drive forward private investment. But rather than embracing these opportunities, the government has given us the worst of all worlds, with neither the money to fund our transport projects and lever in private investment, nor the powers to raise funds and promote the North ourselves. So fourthly, we need the road investment promised. In March 2017, the National Audit Office strongly criticised Highways England, casting doubt on whether existing commitments would be met. They've already pushed back the start dates of 16 road investment schemes and paused 6 others. The A63 improvement in Hull has since been delayed to at least 2020, and my honourable friend for Hull West and Hessel has had to fight really hard to even get a pedestrian footbridge built over the A63 because of the safety considerations before the main work starts in 2020. And I must mention bus services. Northern bus services have been hit really hard. Between 2010 and 11 and 2016-17, bus budgets have been cut by 22% in the North East, 23% in the North West and 37% in Yorkshire and the Humber. 7 in 10 councils have cut bus services since 2010. So the government must now reaffirm the commitments they've made, commit proper funding to the road network and deliver these and future improvements to a proper timescale. Finally, and most fundamentally, we need a long-term, cross-party commitment addressing Britain's regional inequalities and plugging the gap in investment between London and the rest. This needs to be a long-term commitment from both sides of this House, and future budgets could and should be judged by how they reduce these inequalities. So in conclusion, the North's problems are Britain's problems. If we're able to stand any chance of solving the deep-rooted challenges that our country faces, solving our productivity crisis, addressing inequality, increasing our exports post-Brexit, creating stronger UK GDP growth overall, the North must fire on all cylinders. This means rebalancing the economy. And indeed, many of the challenges in our capital, skyrocketing rents and house prices, the chronic congestion that is economically inefficient, bad for health and quality of life, would be much easier to solve if we rebalanced our economy. And I don't wish to deny London the transport investment it requires as the capital city. But the logic of rebalancing the economy was to take pressure off London and the South East by investing in regenerating the North, as much as about trying to keep up with the incessant demand for a never-ending list of massive schemes in and around London. In the digital age, many industries no longer need to cluster in the South East. The government has accepted the argument for rebalancing the economy. Now their actions need to follow their words. And that's why it's in the national interest that the North, for our taxpayers, for our fare payers, for our businesses, should get the fair share of investment that they deserve.
The question